both the House China Select and House Intelligence Committee. Congressman, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. If we could begin first with Iran, because obviously we have seen President Trump authorize the use of force in Iran before in June, after he had said he would decide within 2 weeks. It was 3 days later that Operation Midnight Hammer came down without forewarning to the Gang of Eight or the Intelligence Committee on which you sit. If he decides to move on Iran this time, if there is no deal, do you expect you will be forewarned?
I'm not sure about that. I think their modus operandi is they don't really seem to respect the War Powers Act, and they don't seem to inform Congress before they take these actions, but they must. And here's why. The War Powers Act was put in place a long time ago, especially in the early 1970s after the Vietnam War, because the American people did not want secret wars. They didn't want violence done in their name. They didn't want armed forces deployed in active hostilities without their consent. And so that is what we're looking at here. I'm concerned that we're going to potentially end up in another war in the Middle East. We don't want that. The American people don't want that. And that's something that comes out loud and clear. All that being said, Iran should not have a nuclear weapon. It cannot have a nuclear weapon. And I'm glad that there's negotiations also with regard to ending their ballistic missile program and their nefarious activities in the region. But let's do it diplomatically. Let's negotiate this diplomatically in concert with our friends, partners, and allies.
Well, when Secretary Rubio, Congressman, was asked in congressional testimony about why no one got a heads up, particularly those on the Intel Committee like yourself, he said because the Maduro capture was a trigger-based operation. Do you suspect the answer would be the same about strikes against Iran? Would you be briefed in advance of that action?
I don't see the words trigger-based operation as an exception in the War Powers Act. And as a consequence, I would expect that we would be warned. Obviously, in an emergency situation, the President of the United States has the prerogative to defend our country, and that's a special situation. But where there is no emergency in the sense of the word as it's described in the War Powers Act or elsewhere, he needs to come to us. He needs to advise us. And, of course, if he's going to deploy armed forces in any way, then he needs to get our consent, the consent of the American people.
Well, from your purview on the Intelligence Committee, but also the China Select Committee, when we consider the president and the administration's focus here, is he right to be focusing on the nuclear capabilities of Iran on the Middle East, specifically deploying resources to that region at the expense, perhaps, of having a greater American footprint elsewhere in the Asia-Pacific, for example? I just wonder if you see the president's priorities align with your own when you think about the vast geopolitical landscape under consideration.
I'm much more concerned about the Indo-Pacific region, quite frankly. I'm more concerned about the Chinese Communist Party and their economic, military, and technological aggression than I am about some other theaters. And I'm concerned that taking away assets potentially from those areas, especially in the Indo-Pacific region, but also the European theater, basically is a gift to our adversaries. And when you show weakness and you lower your deterrence, then you invite aggression. And of course, aggression can spark conflict and lead to war. And so that is my overall concern about the Trump administration's foreign policy. It's not about deterrence as much as, making other performative statements, and that lowers our deterrence and could invite war.
Congressman, I want to ask you about the partial shutdown that we're now 4 days into here, and to Kayleigh's point, a State of the Union address that is scheduled for a week from tonight. Before we address the contours of this debate, it doesn't sound like anything has changed since lawmakers left town. Is it appropriate for President Trump to be addressing a joint session of Congress with a portion of the government closed?
Look, I think that it's probably okay to do that. But at the same time, he's got to acknowledge that the American people are not happy with DHS. They have rejected the policies of ICE and CBP. Here in Chicago, they have basically terrorized neighborhoods. He said he was going to come after the worst of the worst. Instead, he separated families, and he basically uprooted communities of peaceful people. And so I think the American people want to see how he's going to completely change what's happening at DHS. And in the meantime, I'm not going to vote to send a single dollar to fund ICE or DHS or CBP right now unless and until some common sense changes are made immediately.
Well, so let's walk through some of those common sense changes that you and your leadership are seeking, Congressman. We know masks has been a sticking point. Judicial warrants seems to be something that Republicans are not willing to budge on either. In the absence of compromise on those issues, how do we get out of this if you aren't willing to send another dollar to the Department of Homeland Security if those things don't change?
Well, I think that they're going to hear from the American people more and more about these particular issues because, as you know, unfortunately, those ICE and CBP operations may resume. And they may actually come back to places like Chicago, which are already traumatized by what happened previously. I got to tell you, like, the mask situation is just common sense. This is something that our local law enforcement has to abide by. They don't wear masks. They wear ID. They wear body cams. They don't do warrantless arrests. And there are third-party investigations of the use of force. And they're not roving around town trying to stir up trouble the same way that Greg Bovino of the CBP was when he was here in Chicago. And so this is like stuff that I think the American people feel is reasonable. It's just what local law enforcement would abide by, and same with CBP and ICE.
Well, you know what a lot of Republican lawmakers tell us, Congressman, and I'm sure we're going to hear this a little bit later this hour from Ken Cuccinelli, is that it's different in this case because these officers are being targeted. They're being doxxed. There is, in fact, an organized effort through signal chats and other forums to try to out these members' identities and their families so they can be targeted at home. How would you respond to that?
Well, look, I think that no member of law enforcement should be treated in such a way if they're performing their duties or, they should not be targeted in this way. Nobody should be. Yeah. However, masks are basically enabling these folks to act in a way that is unaccountable to the American people. In my own area, in my district, they basically snatched an 18-year-old U.S. citizen from her vehicle, tackled her to the ground. They knelt on her knee with their neck, they knelt on her neck with their knee. As she was screaming, "I'm a U.S. citizen, I'm a U.S. citizen," that family came to us and said, "Where did they take my daughter?" And as a father of three, I was horrified. Later on, they only found the daughter when they produced the papers that she was a U.S. citizen. This is completely unacceptable. This should not be happening in the United States of America. And this is why, we are so insistent that some basic standards and requirements must be met.
Well, Congressman, finally, as we look for some degree of transparency as to whether or not we're getting closer to finding agreement on some of those elements, what are you hearing currently from Democratic leadership, from Hakeem Jeffries, as to what communication is currently underway, though you and your colleagues are not in Washington, between negotiators and the White House? Can we get a sense of, even if, Capitol Hill is pretty much empty at this point, how these efforts are working at this time?
Well, my understanding is that there's some text that's being exchanged back and forth, and I understand that some text was exchanged even as late as late yesterday. I don't know the status on the negotiations of that text, but the initial readout, as far as I was told, was not very satisfactory in terms of the Republican response. And so there's probably a ways to go at this point if we had to be candid about it. But I got to tell you, my constituents are livid about CBP and ICE. And, I'm an immigrant myself, so this is a personal issue for me and not just a professional one. And it's something that I think a lot of people are paying attention to right now.